Okay, so hello and welcome to this installment of the Interdisciplinary Research Seminar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. I'm Ghassan Moazin. I'm an assistant professor here and the convener of the series. So today we're very glad and honored to welcome to the Interdisciplinary Research Seminar and to the Institute Professor Jay Winter. I think Professor Winter really doesn't need any introduction, but I'll try my best to give a short one anyways. So Professor Winter is the Charles J. Stille Professor of History Emeritus at Yale University. He was educated at the University of Cambridge and previously taught at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, at Warwick, Cambridge, Columbia, and then eventually at Yale. He is, of course, widely known for his work on World War I and its impact on 20th century, on the 20th century as a whole. Particularly his work, Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, the Great War in European Cultural History, I think is something that most of us will have read and has been very influential. Today, he's going to talk to us about, I think, a current research project that he is engaged in. His talk is entitled Escaping the Holocaust, the Mir Yeshiva from Vilna to Shanghai and beyond. Before I hand things over to Professor Winter, just a brief word about the format. So Professor Winter is first going to give his presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. If you're here in the audience, you can just make yourself known as usual. If you're joining us online, then please ask your questions through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I will then read them out in the Q&A period. But I don't want to take up any more time. So Professor Winter, if you're ready, please feel free to start.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and indeed for the invitation. It's very good to be back in the university to see old friends and to engage in research that to a degree has complicated my paper because I have to rewrite part of it. And the reason is that I found some very rich material in the archives of the Kadoorie banking family in the CLNP archives that are on the other side of the waterway. So you'll see me stop at certain points of my talk and say, and now for the material that has been made redundant by the research that I'm currently engaged in here. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me to use archives, the existence of which I was unaware for a long period of time. The subject of research is the history of statelessness. Statelessness is a category that the political theorist Hannah Arendt famously discussed in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and she locates it as a phenomenon that emerged in the explosion of the First World War and its immediate aftermath. I'm an historian of the First World War, 50 years in the trenches. I have continued to be an historian of the First World War, but I'm trying in some ways to follow up some of the less well-known negative consequences of the war that I haven't dealt with before. And one of them is to make the problem of statelessness a centerpiece of international affairs and of domestic politics. I say this fully aware of the fact that we are in the middle now, globally, of a crisis of statelessness. The largest stateless population, I believe, is the Palestinian people. And the war in Gaza is a war about the stateless. The position of those unfortunate enough to live in eastern Ukraine is about their nationality. The children Putin has brought to other parts of Russia are stateless. They have no rights, they have no papers. They are part of the story of war and statelessness, which is an unfortunate pairing, almost an inextricable embrace. Where there is war, there is statelessness, that I'm going to talk about theoretically on, I believe it's Saturday night in your colloquium, as a problem of political theory. Today, I want to talk about it in terms of a problem of refugee flows and of survival. What I thought that would make sense is to talk about one very small case, microhistory, to exemplify a much larger phenomenon with which we are still grappling. Now, the fundamental point is that refugee flows in the First World War were probably greater than the world had seen since the 17th century. The best studies that I've seen of the demographers in the League of Nations put a population of between 40 and 50 million people as refugees in the years 1917 to 1921, out of the vast theater of warfare, which is called the Russian Civil War, into areas of Asia Minor. A war between Greece and Turkey produced the very first peace treaty signed in 1923 at Lausanne that ended war, not through the exchange of prisoners, but through the forcible exchange of civilian populations. Ethnic cleansing is part and parcel of the experience of war and, in a way, of peace. So that when the Nazis, who were watching very carefully in 1923 what was going on in Lausanne, saw that the world powers were prepared to accept the forcible removal of 1.5 million Greek Orthodox citizens of Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire until that point, and 500,000 Muslims moving the other way from Greece to Turkey. These individuals who were part of the early Nazi movement saw a pathway that they developed with the aid of many different disasters, including the world economic crisis, to follow. So statelessness is a fundamental problem of the aftermath of the First World War without a solution. And according to Hannah Arendt in her classic work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, the state system of the interwar years collapsed into a nation-state system, and those who weren't nationals were stateless. And this included the entire Jewish population of Central Europe. With the outbreak of the Second World War, it meant that those states that were occupied by the Nazis were subject to the same discrimination between the stateless, who were turned into pariahs, ultimately with a death sentence over their heads, or the possibility of flight. So the flight of stateless people is one of the consequences of the First World War. And it became an absolute avalanche in the period after 1939. Now, the beginning of all this is 1914. 1914 was the moment when the Russian army on the Eastern Front forcibly evicted from their homes and villages 500,000 Jewish residents of the Russian Empire. Now, were they citizens? Yes and no. Indeed, in one respect, they were. They were part of the population living in what was called the Pale of Settlement. But most of them, including my father's family, who was part of this story, never saw themselves as Russian citizens. They saw themselves as stateless. And why? Because they were treated with violence by the instruments of the state for decades. Pogroms will do that. It will strip the national sentiment of anybody very rapidly. So after the first upheaval, which in Yiddish is called the Dritter Chorban, the third destruction of the temple, after that disaster, the slow and steady creation of the statelessness problem led to the Nazi seizure of power, one of the causes of it, as well as one of the consequences, and then finally to the outbreak of the Second World War. The question I want to pose on the micro level today is, what did stateless people do in the course of this catastrophe? Frequently, historians speak about the great philanthropic efforts, and that's right. And as I said earlier, very happy to investigate one of them in the archives of the Kaduri family here in Hong Kong. The archives are about their work in Shanghai primarily, but not only. So what I want you to do is to simply think about this image. This is an image which is about stateless people fleeing war, fleeing destruction, fleeing almost certain death. And once again, I believe that the concept of the flight of the stateless is something that cannot be discussed aside from the headlines which we read about in today's papers, and unfortunately tomorrow's as well. Now, this is a group of people in Shanghai in January 1942. There are about 300 of them. And these set of remarks are only about these, but of course, these 300 are a tiny microcosm of an immense problem that I'm trying to illustrate through a small community study. These are people of a Jewish Academy of Higher Education called the Yeshiva. The word yeshiva means sit down, sitting down and studying. And these academies of higher education in Jewish law were spread all over Europe, especially in Northern Europe, especially in Lithuania. Between 1918 and 1939, Lithuania was an independent republic. It became so again after 1989, but in the interwar years, Lithuania was free. So was Poland. Now, in these Northern European states, there were between 20 and 30,000 schools in which the 6 million Jewish residents of Eastern Europe studied in a professional way. That is to say, they studied all the time. They were supported by their communities. It wasn't a high school leading on to higher education. It was higher education. And these yeshivot were extraordinary because their sole focus was on Jewish law and its interpretation over the past 2,000 years in what is called the Talmud. The Talmud is a series of commentaries on the 5 books of Moses. Students start in a yeshiva in their teens, maybe age 14, 13, and then live together for the next 20 years until they marry. Those who teach them are usually married, and their families and other staff form part of a unique community of learning with a shared way of life. Having spent many years at a Cambridge college, I began to see the parallels between the domestic and the intellectual solidarities that are developed in these very close environments. Now, what is unusual about this photograph is that it shows every single member of one of these yeshivot, one of these rabbinical academies, in Shanghai in 1941, actually in January 42. They got there in late 1941 before Pearl Harbor. The question is, how did they get here? How do you go from Lithuania to Shanghai? And I think what is extraordinary to realize is that there were between 10 and 12,000 yeshivot of this kind. There were more schools of different kinds that were the centerpiece of an entire world, a centerpiece of Jewish culture. It is a world that was wiped out. Adolf Hitler won that war. That Jewish world is gone. Of all those 12,000 professional rabbinical academies, one survived intact, only one, and there it is. Every single member of this rabbinical college, if you will, that attended it and studied in it in 1939 was alive in 1945 in Shanghai. And now, as I said, I have to rewrite my paper, also in Hong Kong. The way they got out was through Hong Kong. I'm learning about how it happened, when it happened, and who paid for it in the Kadoorie archives. Now, the important thing to realize, therefore, is that these people, when they fled Lithuania, were the only ones who made it, the only ones who made it out alive. And it is an extraordinary story of survival of the stateless under the most difficult conditions that you could imagine. And I think the important point for, as it were, my talk today is to focus on what the stateless themselves do in order to survive. What we do, what the rich and the famous do, what political leaders do, that's pretty well documented. But those who are, as it were, at the cutting edge of statelessness, there's much less that we know about what they do and how they wound up surviving. These are also people who believe something, which I learned when I was a little boy. I went to one of these academies. I had the curls and the long black coat, et cetera, when I was a little boy. They learned one thing, which is, according to them, the reason that the world was created was for the study of the Torah. The reason why the world was created is so that there can be prayer. Prayer explains creation, not the other way around. And hence, when they were on their long journey and knew very well that everyone in their extended families wasn't leaving, wasn't getting out, they are a bit like Noah's Ark. The flood had already started, but would one single school, one single group of people be able to arrive in a place where they could carry on the reason for their very existence, the study of the Jewish Bible and the commentary? So there is an extraordinary sense, and I think that we should understand that, that the stateless in the 20th century bear on their shoulders several burdens that we must keep account of. The first is that loss is imprinted on every cell of their body. Loss is what the stateless have. It's to a degree who the stateless are. They can create on top of that, but they start with loss. The second is uncertainty about their families. Those who flee know that there are those who didn't. The nightmares that are associated with the stateless position of families in Gaza should be relatively easy for us to understand. I want to link it to this story in a series of important ways. And I think the other thing that is critical is that the decision to escape in order to avoid persecution has immense risks attached to it. One way of understanding my paper is to show a group of 300 people that stateless people have risk takers, very substantial risk takers among them, that explain their survival. But the price of their survival is to make risk taking too difficult in future years. My conclusion, as I want to tell you to you now, is that one of the prices of survival is being risk averse for the rest of your life. It's a bit like businessmen who entertain bankruptcy. They go back into business, but will they take risks thereafter? Statelessness is a kind of political bankruptcy, where the aftermath of it makes one more rigid, perhaps less flexible in dealing with life thereafter. Now, I want to make sure that everyone realizes the chronology of this particular story. Now, this story is about one school only, the only one that survived the Second World War. All the rest were destroyed. Of course, the real prehistory of this is the Munich Agreement between the Western powers and Hitler, or between France and Britain and Italy and Germany, with Czechoslovakia not even being there, to crucify Czechoslovakia, split it in half, then ultimately gobble it up, which led Stalin to sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That was the first step in the Second World War, because in secret codicils to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, there was an agreement that first, on the 1st of September, the Nazis would invade the west of Poland, and the second, 17th of September, after the job was done in the west, the Soviet army would invade the east of Poland and divide it in half. Now, the important point is that these people, those people in that one room that I said to you, that one particular yeshiva, were initially more frightened of Stalin than they were of Hitler. And there were very good reasons in 1937, 1938 to feel that the clear and present danger was the KGB. And so what they decided to do was to go to independent Lithuania. Baltic states were free in 1918 to 1939. They wound up there just a couple of weeks after the outbreak of the Second World War, and everyone knew by that time Poland was dead. And there were millions, between 2 and 3 million refugees, including virtually the entire Jewish population of Eastern Poland, who fled in this direction towards first Lithuania and then to Russia if they possibly could get in. And these people were immediately, these people who fled from Bielorussia were immediately housed in areas around the two great cities of Lithuania, Vilna and Kovno. Now they're called Vilnius and Kaunas, but they're the same cities. And what happened in this particular period is that their attempt to find freedom in independent Lithuania was effectively ruined by the Soviet invasion of Lithuania and their persuasion. The Soviets persuaded Lithuania to accept annexation to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in August 1940. Now, this is August 1940. This is before the German invasion of the Soviet Union. It's before Pearl Harbor. So these particular people, literally along with millions of others, are seeking a safe haven and a place that is safe in no sense of the word. They wind up in Soviet-occupied Lithuania. Their first step towards freedom was therefore a failure. The problem is, what do you do when you're between the Scylla of the Nazis and the Charybdis of the Bolsheviks? What do you do between two great killing machines? My colleague at Yale, Timothy Snyder, has written about this famously in Bloodlands. Nobody knew. Nobody had any idea what to do. This is the heartland of European Jewry. My father's family came from there, from the East. My mother's family came from Warsaw. But everyone, absolutely everyone in that extended family were stateless. They never had passports. They never were part of a state-organized system. And therefore, they were, as Hannah Arendt described, pariahs. They were people who had no right to have rights. That's what Hannah Arendt famously defined as statelessness. You don't have the right to have rights, including the right to live. And Agamben has developed this theory, I think, in contemporary terms that most of us know more about. Well, what do? And I can tell you this from my own early upbringing. When you are stuck in this place, you collect the 300 together and you work out how to ask the rabbinical authorities for guidance, because these are hierarchical institutions. The head of the institution is seen to be the font of wisdom that comes from 2,000 years of Jewish learning. And in this case, the head of their yeshiva, I'll show you him in a moment, turned to their superior. Let's see if I can find it. There's, by the way, that's where they originally had their yeshiva. I'll skip this to show you what it is. They turned to this man on the left with the long white beard. Is at the end of his life. His name was Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, and in virtually all of the literature of the period, he's simply known as Reb Chaim Ozer. He was the chief and the most distinguished rabbinical authority in the world, and he had, through his control of the Council of Yeshivot, or the Council of Schools, and indeed of the philanthropic agencies that were attached to Jewish life, he had a very substantial fortune to distribute in the aid of refugees who came to Lithuania. So what happened was that this particular gentleman was presented with the question, after Hitler invaded the west of Poland, Stalin invaded the east of Poland and then annexed Lithuania. What do we do? How do we survive? And this particular man, who was, as I say, a legendary figure, was 77. He had cancer, and he was literally broken by the pressure that was on his shoulders. You can imagine, he's responsible basically for the survival of between 200,000 and 300,000 refugees in Lithuania. Yes, there were many people supporting him elsewhere in the world, but nonetheless, the issue is what to do, what to do. And this individual took a retreat. He literally closed his doors and sat and studied the learned texts, the Bible and the Talmud, for a week, and at the end of it, he made his public ruling. It's called a kol korai, which means a voice that should be read. not just heard, but read. And his answer was, I can find no clear guidance from the Jewish books of wisdom, from the Torah, from the books of Moses, from the commentaries. I see no answer. And in Talmudic study, it's very straightforward. I remember it as a boy. When you can't find an answer that is clear, don't pretend that you have a solution to the problem. And the way it is stated in Jewish text is very straightforwardly. It's the verdict, the bottom line, the story, as it were, the outcome is in Hebrew, shev v'ta'aseh klum. That means sit down and don't do anything. Sit down and don't do anything. The whole of the Jewish world sitting on the edge of this volcano before the German invasion of the Soviet Union, before Pearl Harbor, before the World War turned into exactly what it was, a world war. At that moment, this is what the great rabbinical authority told them. And there are 12,000 yeshivot that listened and followed, and one that said no. The Mir Yeshiva, the one yeshiva that said no. Now, what you should probably understand is, I'm not sure whether we could find analogies here, maybe or agree on analogies, but I think it might be equivalent to standing up and denouncing the Secretary General of the Communist Party of France in 1939. You don't do it and expect to survive. If you challenge the authority in these authoritarian institutions, which are vertical, the word of the, as it were, of the Central Committee is the one that counts, then you are going to be cast out of the community. And one individual, this particular man, Avraham Kotler, said the same thing. He said that anyone who leaves Vilna, anyone who doesn't follow the rabbi's judgment, is an enemy of the Jewish people. You know, for these, this is completely crazy. It has again, it has something like the Trotskyite Stalinist divisions of the 1930s, where the betrayal is just underneath every single piece of paper. He denounced the men of the Mir Yeshiva to such a point that the head of that yeshiva, here's the Yehuda Finkel, who was the head of that 300 band of brothers, said, I can't do anything other than to follow the rabbi. And he stayed there, and fortunately he survived individually. He survived as an individual who found his way later on to Palestine. But his assistant, this particular gentleman, Yechezkel Levenstein, Mashgiach Ruchani means a spiritual advisor. He said, we have to be a democracy. This is, it never happened in my life, that this group would take a vote, but they took a vote, and the vote was unanimous in favor of leaving, not to follow the rabbi. And the man who organized it was this fellow, Reb Aryeh Leib Malin. Now, these are strictly Orthodox, totally observant individuals who were put in a position where they believed to stay put, shev v'ta'aseh klum, don't do anything, is suicide. And suicide is against Jewish law. You have to do anything to avoid suicide, if possible. There's a phrase, you can break any law in order to save life. It's called pikuach nefesh, which means the protection of a spirit. It can mean many different things. My mother was a pianist. She came from this world, and she got a scholarship to Juilliard College, and then went to try to be a conductor under Toscanini, and the ship left on the Sabbath. Her father, my grandfather, said, Pikuach Nefesh, will break the rules because her soul is a musician's soul. In order to make her soul come alive, you break law. And these 300 individuals, therefore, use the principle of Pikuach Nefesh, that anybody who's been in the middle of Jewish life will know about, in order to break the authority of the rabbi who was their master. All right, they took a decision unanimously to break away and accept the opprobrium, to accept the condemnation. How do they get out? Well, the way they got out is partly known. The first thing is they found this gentleman. His name is Jan Zwartendijk. And he was a Dutch businessman, the head of the Philips company, selling radios in Lithuania. I think he was also selling some kitchen implements. That's what his job was. He was an honorary consul. He was a businessman, the way in which these individuals worked. And a woman who was related to one of the Mir Yeshiva gentlemen studying there came up to this man and said, I would really, really like to settle in the island of Curacao off the coast of South America. Would you, as a Dutch consul, be able to give me an entry visa, because I'm Dutch, to Curacao? And he said, yes, that would be your right. I have to add, he said that the governor has a final disposition of such entry passes, but I'll give it to you. And then she said, well, could you leave out that last sentence, that the governor has the final disposition, and just give me an entry visa? And he says, well, why not? These are difficult times. The next day, she came back with two members of the Mir Yeshiva and said, could you give us 300 of those entry visas into Curacao? Nobody had ever heard of Curacao before, and the last thing in the world that was on their mind was to go there. It's utopia. It's somewhere where you can live, but it wasn't a real destination. And with these entry visas, they then went 2 streets away in Kaunas, and they found this gentleman, whose name is Chiuni Sugihara. Sometimes, by the way, that's spelled with an I and sometimes with an E, his given name. And Sugihara was a Japanese spy who had been placed in Lithuania to observe troop movements. You know, this is about 100 kilometers away from where the German army is massing. The Russian troop movements are visible right outside of his window. So he did an awful lot of information gathering, I think is the right way to put it, at a desperately complicated moment where the Japanese Foreign Office and military wanted to know what's going on in the war zone in Poland and further east. And they went to this man and said, we have entry visas to Curacao. Our intention is to go from Vilna to Vladivostok, get on a boat, and use Japan as a transit stop on the way to Curacao. And they asked him, would he give them a transit visa to Japan? With I've seen 3 of them. They say either 2 or 3 week period of residence in Japan. Later on, that in fact was renewed, but the initial request was for a couple of weeks in Japan through Kobe. And Sugihara said yes. Then he cabled his superiors in Tokyo and asked them, is this all right? And they said, we're not happy about this at all, but let's take further advice. And in that period of indecision where the Foreign Office didn't say yes and it didn't say no, but it wasn't happy, Sugihara was approached by the same people and said, would you possibly give us 300 of these transit visas? And he said yes. In fact, he gave a lot more than that, not to this group, but to other people too. And with those 2 pieces of paper, then came the question is, how are they going to get from Vilna to Vladivostok? And the answer was they had to buy rail tickets from in-tourists. They had to go into the belly of the whale. They had to face the KGB. This may be the reason why that great rabbi, Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, said, don't do it. Because anyone who says to the KGB in 1940, I would like to leave the Soviet Union and go and settle in Curacao, might be a candidate for the Gulag. In fact, it would be probable that that would be the outcome of this approach. But what choice did they have? So they decided to go to in-tourist anyway, and they were lucky, very lucky, in that they were at a moment where the Soviet interest primarily was in dollars. So they said, unfortunately, given world circumstances, we're going to have to multiply the cost of the tickets of the 13-day train ride from Vilna to Vladivostok by a multiple of 5. And would you be able to provide us with the equivalent of $88,000 in American cash over the next 5 days in order to do this. Well, that's where this particular gentleman is called Zorach Vahavtik, who was the head of a Zionist group that was in Lithuania at the same time. And what he did, and through other cables, through the rabbi's office, was to get in touch with ultra-Orthodox communities in New York. It was just on the edge of the Sabbath. Friday night to Saturday night is where you do nothing. The day of rest means no monetary business. But given the circumstance, these people went into the synagogues and said, get your checkbooks out. Where are your pens? No writing. You're not supposed to write. Certainly not supposed to have any financial dealings. And these people found the money. It's the equivalent of $11 million in the course of 5 days, which they cabled to Interdisciplinary in St. Petersburg, and then finally the money arrived sufficiently to create 300 tickets that spanned the rail voyage from Vilna to Vladivostok. And this is what they did. Now, the top line is the itinerary. It's the transit of the Mir Yeshiva. The southern line was where many other people who were interested in escaping from Europe to Shanghai wound up. But at this stage, Shanghai wasn't on anybody's agenda. What happened instead was they got to Vladivostok and then to Kobe, and then didn't know what to do. They had no intention of going to Curacao. They could not go to the United States because they couldn't get visas. They couldn't go to anywhere controlled by the British, in particular Palestine, who wanted to control the balance between Jewish and Arab populations. They were stuck. At which point, after renewal and renewal and renewal of the Japanese transit visa, the Japanese Navy took the decision to transport them to another occupied city. You know, Vilna had been occupied by the Nazis. The closest occupied city that would get these people out of Japan while the preparation for Pearl Harbor was going on was Shanghai. So all 300 of them were sent to Shanghai, and they wound up there at the end of literally end of the summer of 1941, before December 1941, after the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Nazis. So by the time they got to Japan, the whole world of Vilna was destroyed. And indeed, 50% of those who had sought refuge in Vilna in 1939 were dead by the 1st of July, 1941. The massacres were immediate. And the sites that are still visible today are evidence to that. Now, there's just one additional step that I want to take before talking about the consequences of this odyssey. One additional step. In Shanghai, they were able to stay in a particular region of the city, Hangzhou. Sometimes it's spelled K-E-W. And in 1943, the Japanese decided to, shall we say, make a gesture towards their Nazi allies. There's a lot of good research on the position of Japan vis-a-vis these Jewish refugees. And some of it shows a certain kind of what I would call distorted philo-Semitism, that they thought Jews controlled the world and therefore they could make a difference in American politics, or else they were immensely wealthy and having them on your side might be better than not. There are all kinds of discussions. There were Nazis in Shanghai, like every other kind of human being, who thought that the Jewish population could be killed. But ultimately, the Japanese Navy did not give in to the Nazi effort to destroy the Jewish people, but they made them live in a ghetto without barbed wire. There's one area of Hangzhou which became the necessary residence for stateless people. The Brits by then were all interned. You know, the Kaduri family, for example, they were interned. But the stateless people, the people who came from that extraordinary world of Jewish life, they were in this ghetto and they survived it. Now, when they got to Shanghai in September 1941, they went into this place. It's an astonishing building, doesn't exist anymore. And the reason why I'm telling you it is so unlikely, you know, in my view, the survival of individual stateless communities is miraculous. It needed so much luck, so many accidents that turned into positive opportunities, so many doors that had to be slightly ajar, otherwise they couldn't go through. And this is the most extraordinary one of them all. There were three enormously wealthy Jewish businessmen in Shanghai. One was Sassoon, the other was Kaduri, and the third was a man called Hardoon. And Silas Hardoon was a man who made a lot of money in real estate and through prostitution, and in probably a lot of other illegal ways too. He married out of the faith and died in 1931. His wife took over the big estate and the fortune and created a very substantial network of brothels that operated throughout the 1930s and the 1940s. In 1930, just before he died, Silas Hardoon had a fit of conscience, God knows why, but he wanted to do something good instead of leave a legacy of, shall we say, dubious action. And he decided to build a synagogue in the name of his father Aaron, and that synagogue was not touched with a barge pole by any respectable Jewish person in Shanghai for 10 years. The day that the Mir Yeshiva winds up in Shanghai in the boat, they move right in. And the image that I showed you before of the people, let's see if I can go right all back to the beginning. This one. That's the inside of that building. They just, all 300 of them, it's big enough. They had the kitchens, it had the dormitories, it had everything that they could possibly, in a city as overcrowded and really as ruthlessly exploited as Shanghai during the Second World War. This was a godsend. And they stayed there for a year. The ghetto required them to leave, but they found ways of coming back to do the studies that you see there. And in the course of their 2 years that they were there, they effectively created what shall I call it? A Noah's Ark of study. They benefited from the printing industry of Shanghai because there are 52 volumes in the Talmud. It's enormous. They printed the whole thing out. They developed their own printing press to work on the scholarship that they had begun before they had left, and ultimately survived until the liberation of Shanghai in 1944. Then came the question of where to go. Here's where I say I need to rewrite my paper. Now I know. They wound up in the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong. Why? Because Kaduri persuaded American officers that there was nowhere else for these people to go in transit. Can you imagine? In transit has been going on for 5 years. And this particular transit was waiting for shipping to take them across to Vancouver and then to New York. Now, I have no idea whether these people created their own yeshiva in the Peninsula Hotel, but I can tell you that I'm going to find out. And the archive that is in the CLNP basement is quite extraordinary, is something that I think might throw some light on what happened to these people in Hong Kong. All of it was paid for by the Kaduri family. All right. When they finally got out, they split into two branches. One branch went to Brooklyn in New York, the other one to Jerusalem. And there they are to this day. They are people who have been fruitful and multiplied. The yeshiva, the Jewish Rabbinical College in Jerusalem, is the biggest in the world. It has 8,000 students in it. It's 300. The one in Brooklyn is relatively small. It only has 6,000 in it. But it's still one of the centerpieces of this world. The conclusion I want to draw from this story is that in order to survive, stateless people had to take risks that are in some ways appalling to imagine. They had to violate every instinct of loyalty to their teachers, and indeed to their head teacher. He died. He died very rapidly in that summer after he made his decision. And so did every other yeshiva in that part of the world. The whole of Lithuanian Jewry, Vilna was called the Jerusalem of the North. It was 45% Jewish, as was the city of Kaunas. All the other rabbinical academies, every other one, perished. Individuals survived, individuals fled, but collectively, this story is unique. It's the only case of its kind where one entire community took the risk in order to survive. What happened to them after is the subject of very big controversy, and some of the people in this story, who are the survivors, don't want me to publish this because it moves away from their what I would call heroic interpretation. What has happened since the Second World War is that this yeshiva was reconstituted in two forms, and both of them are entirely different from that which existed in the interwar years. In that period, which was, if you will, the renaissance, the high point of intellectual creativity of this intellectual and jurisprudential world, these people took risks, developed all kinds of intellectual solutions to problems of how to live in the modern world, of war and peace, all kinds of questions. When they came, as it were, to rebuild their world after the Second World War, they turned from what I would call innovators into fundamentalists. They lost the zest for risk. They lost the sense that questions need to be left open in order to find answers that maybe now we can't even dream of. They turned into rigid, hard interpreters of scripture as opposed to innovative tradition, and they are among the major supporters of the current Israeli government. Now, I'm leaving the politics out of it. It's not something I want to get into at all. What I'm interested in is what is the damage that survival brings with it. And one of them is a move away from risk. I'm not sure if this is true. It's something that I think I believed in when I taught economic history at Cambridge many years ago. And that, Marx is wrong. The real division between human beings is between risk takers and risk averse people. That's the real fundamental division. It's something I see in my children quite clearly. One is entirely on one side and one is entirely on the other. And when you've taken a risk that is so great, going into Noah's Ark without knowing that the flood will come to an end, there'll be, as it were, a dove that shows you that you can land, taking enormous risks, violating your conscience of loyalty to your teachers and so on, in order to survive, pikuach nefesh, to save life. When that happens, it may be that the rest of life has no place in it for risk. And the only room intellectually that exists is for certainty. Those who are certain about religious principles are what we call fundamentalists. They go back to the certitude of text. That's where they are today. They weren't there before. I just wanted to say that every time I read about a flight of the stateless in Palestine or elsewhere, I think about both sides of this story. The story of the courage that it takes to defy tradition and the price in terms of intellectual closure that may be necessary in order to survive. Refugee life, the life of the stateless, not all stateless are refugees, and not all refugees are stateless, to be sure, but refugee life has costs attached to it, which make loss the center of the interpretation that I think all of us, with some degree of compassion, should develop. This is a story of a defeat. The Nazis won that war. This world, the world I just described to you, is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. Even the survivors haven't survived. What they've done is recreated their lives in a way that is meaningful to them. I'm not going to judge them, but I would say that in order to understand what refugees go through, we should understand the hidden costs of survival. It's with that message that I'd like to Thank you for your attention today.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Winter, for this wonderful lecture. As I said, we now have some time for questions and answers. If you're online, please submit them through the Q&A button. If you're here, please just make yourself known. Do we have any questions? Oh, yes, please, over there.
Hi, thank you so much for the amazing talk. So my question is based on the notion of statelessness. And I think maybe it's a very loose definition because during the 20th century, in the 19th century, nation state system just being created. So maybe the statelessness is more attached to its historical value rather than its conceptual value, because it's hard for us to find right now. It's like, how do we define statelessness, right? For example, Hong Kong is a society built by refugees from China, right? Are those people be defined as statelessness, or and also my question is also the difference between stateless and a nationless. And I believe for those groups of people you just introduced, I don't think they are a nationless. They has a strong emotion of nationalities in them. A nationality in terms of how Benedict Anderson define nationality, it is not like more than nation. It's just a share same language, share same culture, and like how those two terms, statelessness and nationlessness, if that exists, like how they compared. And I'm just wondering if we are trying to make an analogy, it's like what's the modern counterpart of what's a modern example of the statelessness, right? For example, I know there's now Chinese people, they are trying to get to States. There is a very famous term called walking the lines, right? They don't get a visa. They go to States through Mexico and they cross the border and then they become refugees in States. Like, are they statelessness? So yeah, they're basically two questions. Thank you.
Right. Well, this is not an evasion, I will answer, but that's the topic of my lecture on Saturday. Exactly your question. I'm speaking at the annual colloquium. I'm not quite sure what the end of the year conference is, but at 4 o'clock on Saturday, I'm lecturing on statelessness and nationality. Exactly. So let me summarize what I will say then.
Thank you.
The first is that the primary definition of statelessness is that you are excluded from a political community. You don't have a vote. And in Hannah Arendt's classic analysis in The Origins of Totalitarianism, you have, which is an argument against Aquinas, against Rousseau, against the notion of human rights. Human rights, she says, provide you with nothing, because those who have no place in the political world do not have the right to have rights. I said that at the beginning of my talks. In order to have the right to have rights, you have to be a member of a political community. And believe me, in the United States, those who cross the border have no rights, none. They're not part of the political community. Now, some of them have nationality that they want to flee, but others have no nationality at all, none. And it depends on many different, I think, criteria to see how one group or the other group is handled as stateless. The current position, I think, is completely confused. That is to say, statelessness is an embarrassment. Stateless people are anomalies. They shouldn't be there. Everyone should have a right. Many stateless people are children, and yet do children have rights on their own? It's very difficult to see. There's an international convention, a UN convention on this. No one has made any progress in clarifying the matter. Those who are stateless, I believe, and this is an answer to your second point, are able, and these people are among them, to perform the political rights that they don't have. This is the paradox. In some ways, it's an Aristotelian paradox. The paradox is that by living together as a political group and making political decisions, we have the right to live here. We have the right to go to Curacao. We have the right to go to Japan and so on. They are pretending that they are a political collective before they have the right to be so. They don't have it. And in my view, this is the main weakness of Hannah Arendt's political theory. It's a long story, and I hope to do justice to it on Saturday. But the fundamental point is that Hannah Arendt saw the stateless as people who were effectively condemned to death with a stay of execution. And this has been used by Agamben and other philosophers, I think in very original and creative ways, to talk about what's called bare life. They have the right to be fed and nothing else. Now, during that period of statelessness, my claim is that political life is constructed by those who have no rights. That those who are stateless, who have no political rights, who do not have the right to rights, perform that absence of rights politically. And I will call it parapolitics, or what might be described as a kind of liminal politics, politics between statelessness and citizenship. And when you raise the issue of Hong Kong, that's what I'd like to ask you to specify. What kind of liminality is it? Do they have political rights or do they not? And who do they have political rights? Where? Do you have the right to go to China? Do you have the right to stay here indefinitely without any stay as any limit of time? These legal problems are beyond me. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an international lawyer. But I do believe that they are the same problems. Palestinians have some papers. I've seen them. I've been to the West Bank. I haven't been to Gaza, but I've been to the West Bank and seen them. But they're not members of a state. They're not. Even if the United Nations recognizes the Palestinian Authority, the individuals who are living under Israeli rule are still stateless. They have no rights. They may have a document without having rights. They may have rights without the document. This is the what I would call the extraordinarily fluid and murky area we live in. Your point is valid. People who feel a nation have the right to have rights, but there are millions of them who are frustrated precisely in that endeavor. Whichever side you're on the, or if you will, on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian quarrel, one group of people in this quarrel have citizenship and the right to have rights, and the other one doesn't. And nobody has found a solution to it, short of brutality and atrocity. It's the same. I think there's the same thing in Eastern Ukraine. You know, the removal of large numbers of people from Ukraine, the annexation of sections of the East is an outrageous violation of human rights. But human rights mean nothing without citizenship. This is Hannah Arendt's fundamental view, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights signed in 1948 was of no consequence. That's her view. She wrote her book in 1951, right afterwards. And it is an attack on human rights as sufficient to protect anyone from being murdered or killed in the course of an armed incursion like the Israeli one, or the Israelis who were killed by Hamas before that. There's a fundamental problem that all of us, I think, need to face anywhere in the world. That no one has defined how to turn the stateless into citizens. No one has been able to do it. And I'm going to try to set that problem out on Saturday.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, Joe.
Thank you. Just to follow up on the point you made about Mir Yeshiva after Hong Kong was split into two, right? One group went to Jerusalem, the other went to Brooklyn. You're talking about the group going after arriving in Jerusalem, they turned very conservative.
Right.
What about the other group?
Even more.
Or even more?
Even more. I don't think there's a lot of exchange between these two communities. When I'm referring to their conservatism, I primarily mean in doctrinal interpretation and biblical authority, but it moves in all kinds of directions. The one fundamental shift that took place, these people were not Zionists. They didn't believe that there should be a state of Israel. They were not political. That's part of what statelessness is. You live in another dimension. You know, as I said, my father was born in Brest-Litovsk, on the edges of Byelorussia. My mother and my mother's family in Warsaw, they never thought that they were Russian or Polish, ever. They weren't. They were Jewish. They had no political rights and they didn't want them. They didn't use the political system, they didn't use the legal system, and they certainly didn't want to use the military system, which was a source of misery. So I think the answer is that on both sides, there was a shriveling of intellectual courage. I'm sorry to use that word. It sounds that I'm condemning them. I'm not. I feel that they have lost something that is beautiful, but we can't blame them for that loss.
Yeah, maybe.
Thank you very much, Professor Winter. That was a wonderful and also very moving story. I felt like I detected two narratives or perspectives in your story. One, a story about collectives and structures, about the way in which certain lived experiences can shape the intellectual, cultural outlooks of an entire community. And then another story which was highly contingent on the behavior of individuals, whether it's Sugihara or Mitsuki, or the leader of the Mir Yeshiva mob, if I remember the names correctly. And I was wondering how one reconciles these two perspectives, the kind of the social and the individual, and the story you told of this collective vote in the yeshiva where as a self-constituting political body, the yeshiva decides we're going to take this decision. Sort of seems like a moment where the two intersect, but how can one as a historian methodologically make sense of these moments?
I think, you're pointing out something profound and I think important in the history of refugee life. This group believed that survival was only possible collectively, that if they let 20 of their members escape in one way or another, they were destroying the community. Now, this notion of collectivism, if you will, Klal Yisrael is the phrase they would use, is much more general than that. It's a notion that there is a unity that has to be maintained no matter what, no matter what. And I take that to be a greater power. It's a more essential element in the story than the individual quirks. As I said, there are people who, if Sugihara hadn't given those visas, I'm not sure what would have happened. They might have gone up and smoked like everybody else. On the other hand, to imagine escape is a collective act. And I think that's where I would try to answer you seriously, because you're asking something fundamental about this story. There is, I think, a fundamental notion in this group, which had spent its entire life collectively, its entire life together. They ate together, they slept together, they did everything together, that if they survive, that they survive together. Would it be true to say the opposite? There were another 11,000 who did the opposite, that they too lived out a collective destiny by dying together. There's a writer in the Warsaw Ghetto, a man called Shimon Huberband, who is an amazing. There's an archive called Oneg Shabbat that was unearthed after the war. Unfortunately, part of it is now under the Chinese embassy in Warsaw, but most of it was found. And it's a whole series of books that were written by people who were about to be killed, who wanted people to know about not how Jews died, but how they lived. And one of them, this polymath, wrote a book about how we now can't accept the idea of martyrdom. Martyrdom means nothing when you don't have a choice. You have to choose. And if you can't choose, so what we need to do is to change a fundamental premise of our beliefs. That premise said, you die for Kiddush Hashem. In Hebrew, that means to sanctify the name of the Lord. Well, what he said is, it's time for us to sanctify the name of the Lord, not by dying, but by living, and to make the idea of martyrdom outside the window. The collective is that which survives once it realizes that dying is not, it doesn't give life any meaning. These people, and I put myself in their shoes when they had to deal with these issues. It's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. Their terms of reference were collective. And I think if anything, I should change the phrase the phrasing of this paper to make that point clearer. And I thank you for the comment.
Jay, thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I also look forward to your fully explanation of statelessness on Saturday, right? So I'm curious about the Japanese role
Yes.
in helping this group, or broadly defined with big groups, because as you know, the Chinese diplomat as well as Japanese diplomat
Yes.
helped the Jews to flee.
Yes.
So when this group came to Shanghai, you mentioned the Japanese Navy sent
Yes.
them to Shanghai,
Yes.
but then later on they came to Hong Kong.
Yes.
Hong Kong also was at Japanese control.
Yes.
So did the Japanese government really intentionally support or save or help the Jews?
This is-
Obviously, just as you mentioned earlier, there's some minutes of forces get into play.
I think you've used a very, I might say characteristically, shrewd intelligence to point out to one of the weaknesses of the paper. There's a historian, an American historian of Japanese origin named Gao Bei, who's written extensively on this. And in a book of essays called Beyond, it's called Statelessness Beyond Arendt that I put together. She has a chapter on the Japanese role in saving Jewish lives. And I said to her, is it right to use the word saving with all of the moral kudos that goes along with it? Or did they simply stop other people from killing the Jews of Shanghai? They could have done worse. Should we applaud them for the fact that they didn't listen to the Nazis? They didn't send the Jews of Shanghai to an island, or even there was a story circulated, it might have been rumor, onto a ship and then sink the ship. There were many discussions of this. My view is that what the Japanese did is permit Jews to find the only place in the world where you could be stateless and just show up and have residence. Shanghai needed no visa. It's the only city in the world where there were no visas required. Statelessness was the name of life in Shanghai during the Second World War. There were other, shall we say, games going on at the same time. But the reason why these people could go there was because they were not foreign nationals. And when Pearl Harbor broke out, these people weren't interned because they weren't Brits. They weren't the Kaduris. They weren't the Sassoons. They didn't have a nationality that made them enemies. They were in limbo. They were nowhere effectively between the two. So I tried to get Gao Bei to qualify her view that the Japanese as a nation, and the Navy in particular, ought to be awarded the honor of being just among the nations in Jerusalem. That's her view. I don't see it that way. You know, to make it possible for people to escape execution may be the right way to put it. But their motives were, as you know, entirely complex, some of which were based upon a kind of bizarre philo-Semitism that I described. Others are maybe even worse than that. But the important point is that the people who survived were saved, I believe, not by the Japanese or the Chinese for that matter, but by their own efforts. And one of the fundamental arguments I'm going to try to make on Saturday is that we have to focus more on the stateless to see how they got out of it than to congratulate the authorities, diplomatic in other words, for ushering them into the room of citizenship. It's a difficult matter. I didn't succeed in persuading my Japanese colleague. She won't budge. What does an editor of a book do when an author doesn't budge? Many of you have had the same experience I do. The answer is you give in, because academic freedom means that there are multiple points of view. I did say in the introduction, I'm going to point out that there's more than one interpretation available, and we're going to see which one of them has the greater weight. But your point, I think, is one that I would answer. No, the Japanese Navy didn't save Jewish life. It stopped as a word, blocked efforts to kill Jews, but blocking murder saving life? In a way, yes. In a way, no. Are people today responsible for the deaths of Palestinians every time an Israeli bit of armament or American armament is dropped on them? That seems to me to be part of the same story. How do we measure responsibility for salvation?
Just not directly related to the to your topic, but a little bit relevant. Just include some very complex background about what you mentioned regarding Japanese involvement in it. Because one thing also ironic or paradoxical, when Japanese decide to actually, not only decide, launch the East Asia Holocaust in Chinese, when they moved to Nanjing, so to get so-called Nanking Massacre. The Nazi officers in Nanjing helped to save Chinese life by protecting them. Right. So that's, of course, that's very, very documented now. Especially with some gentlemen's Nazi officers' diary were unearthed. So that's, I guess, conveyed to us as a historians how the history become very complicated and sometimes difficult to explain.
Let me just add a line to that, because I think it goes back to the question of how do you define statelessness. Civilians who are targeted in war have no rights. They become stateless. The rape of Nanjing is the murder of citizens who were turned into stateless people, and whose murder was made possible by the fact that they had no rights. And I think one of the things that is extraordinary is the wolatility, is where the quicksilver nature of statelessness. It's not something that you have forever, and it's not something that you can avoid. There are people who effectively are reduced to being the objects of violence, who I believe are stateless, whether or not they have a passport, whether or not they have some ambassador somewhere who might be able to help them. At the moment of the massacre, so far as I would say, all the victims of the Nanjing genocide were stateless people. Let me put it to you, Koki. It seems to me that the question of statelessness, and the reason why Shanghai is an open city, also relates to the question of what kind of state was China in the Second World War, with fractured in how many different dimensions, in how many different lines. To what extent does it make sense to talk about, let's say, the Chinese police in Shanghai as citizens of China? Of course they were, but to a certain extent, the Shanghai Municipal Police was still a British operation, and the French concession remained open, at least until 1943. Remained a French colonial administration. So I would say statelessness is much more probable in wartime than it is in peacetime, but it happens in peacetime as well. And we should interrogate the category of statelessness more than we have done in the past. It's a danger, and I think it's a trap. And when you fall into it, you're there.
Thank you. I think there's a question at the back.
Thank you for this very illuminating lecture. I'm learning a lot. I would like you to go back to Kadoorie, if you would.
Yes.
Here in Hong Kong, I at least sort of know the name. I hear about the family, but I'd like to hear how they fit into the story. What were they doing in Shanghai in the first place? What nationality did they have? What is their family history?
Yes. Well, it's a Baghdadi family that became one of the great merchant and banking families of the late 19th and early 20th century. Their primary role was through education, also through hospitals, but education. And the mother of two figures, Horace and Lawrence Kadoorie, who were essential in the Second World War in this period. The mother died in 1918, I think, in a fire in Shanghai. And the loss of this woman was a devastating moment for the whole family. The two sons who basically operated at their father's instruction, who operated the business empire, financed the schooling system in Shanghai. And they were prepared in Hong Kong to finance through worldwide donations the education of stateless children through the course of the Second World War. When the Japanese were defeated, the question is, will anyone like the stateless of Shanghai have a place in the new China? And the answer is no. The old system, of extraterritoriality was gone, China for the Chinese, and therefore these individuals, these people had to go. The question is where and how. And one way in which it was operated was through Australia. So there were a substantial number of individuals who were in Shanghai who were taken by the Australian Navy to Melbourne, and they have created their own community there. I spoke at one of their meetings 2 weeks ago on my voyage before coming here to Hong Kong. But then came the questions what to do with the people who can't go to Australia, because the Australians weren't happy about having substantial numbers of refugees anyway. And so there was no answer. And the Kaduris basically said, the time for us to help these people is now, and the only place that we can really offer is our own property. Now, I understand that before the new airport was built, splendid airport, the old airport was very small, and the place where you checked in for your flight was the Peninsula Hotel. That was the check-in desk for whatever companies, the British in particular, but not only British Airways in its then garb would have. So what Lawrence Kadoorie did was to persuade American officers to allow all of the people waiting for transit on to Vancouver and then other parts of the state and other parts of the world to remain in the ballroom on the 6th floor of the Peninsula Hotel. And with Frederick Makota, who's one of the relatives that are still resident in Hong Kong, I can tell you that there's a particularly fine Chinese restaurant on that floor, and we went to the place where it happened. And the photographs are very substantial photographic records in the Kadoorie archives. They stayed there for 3 months, and they were an almighty headache to the Americans who were here, and I'm sure the British as well. They finally got out in late 1945. I think it was October, the beginning of October 45, and then made their way to their new existence. This is what I found so far, but unfortunately, yesterday's archival find is not today's presentation, but I promise you it will be someday. Yes. Would you like a mic?
I wonder if you can make some comments on the museum in Shanghai. There's a Jewish museum, and I visited it with a Jewish friend, and it was taking quite a long time for a lot of detailed observation of those artifacts and photographs.
Right.
And so I just like to relate it to your validation or statement that they survive by their own effort. Of course, from your narrative here, there's a lot of details, but perhaps for looking into the artifacts and so on, there could be a further perspective about what does it mean by own effort and what about friendship and so on.
Right. What I'm once again, if you have the time on Saturday, I'm going to talk about 6 dimensions of their efforts at survival. But as I said in answer to Guo Qi's question, I find it disturbing that museum has a political agenda. The agenda is to say that the Chinese people are humane, and they saved Jewish lives. Alongside, the colleague who made the same statement about the Japanese Navy. Now, I don't for a moment deny the fact that there was immense kindness and solidarity and sharing among Chinese and non-Chinese people. From the viewpoint of the refugees, I can tell you they wanted to stay as far apart as they could. They wanted to be separate, but they couldn't because they were all living literally on top of each other in the same city. I don't want you to get the impression that I believe that the Chinese population of Shanghai was irrelevant in the survival of these 20,000, 22,000 refugees. But the museum is making a political point. And so far as I can tell, every time that a museum makes a political point, it retreats from historical honesty. It is a strange phenomenon to believe that the business of a museum is to show the Chinese how proud they should be for a moment in history when their country was drawn and quartered, and in which a multifaceted civil war is going on of immense brutality. There's nothing about the Nanjing story in the Shanghai Museum. There should be, because it's part of the same story. I'm very, I don't know, maybe you could say yourself what you felt. I found it uncomfortable to be in that museum in Beit Rachel. That's one. The one here is called Beit Leah, and the one in Shanghai is called Beit Rachel.
Thank you for inviting my perspective. I grew up in Hong Kong, and I think traveling around the world, I am concerned about peace. And I think I honor what you're saying, which is to say, don't be fooled by just mere political agenda. And so this is a very easy way to turn something which is partly true and partly untrue into absolute truth, whether it's you or whether it's me or whether it's anybody else, because you say that academic freedom is about multiple perspectives. So, but I do feel that we are not talking about a political agenda. When I view it with a Jewish friend, we are looking at a very fragile time or wartime, and there are little stories which you can say exaggerate 10 times or whatever, but they are factual. So my reading of that museum is a very deep, sobering thought about the wartime and the pain and how ordinary people in the street, how ordinary people are beyond the political agenda, and they do offer help. And then there are people who come back. And of course, you can say they can dress it up or whatever, but I don't know. I only can answer you, I don't know enough to make a strong view, but I do feel that peace and war is really about political parties, political powers, as well as ordinary people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have any other question? There's actually, yes. So there's a question from Professor Jackie Armijo. She says, thank you for a fascinating talk on such an important topic, especially at this moment in time. Although I understand the conclusion that having made such a risky decision to try to survive can later lead to a certain conservatism or fundamentalism, I can't help but think about the community of Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn who are so adamant and outspoken in their support for the rights of Palestinians. Do you have a theory or explanation as to why that community is so steadfast in their beliefs?
I had a friend, a wonderful Israeli writer, Amos Oz, who said that having grown up in Jerusalem made him automatically one of the world's authorities on comparative fanaticism. There's something about the Middle East dispute that provokes and amplifies distortion. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been going on since 3 years after my birth in 1945, the state of Israel was born. It's been going on ever since. I see it as a tragedy in which two stateless people fought over the same area of land, and they're still fighting over it. Those who created the state of Israel were stateless. They didn't have anywhere to go. And I believe that the existence of the state of Israel in 1948 was justified precisely because stateless people need a place as a safe haven. But the development of the politics of the Middle East has turned that safe haven into an occupying force over a much larger population of Palestinians. And that conversion of Israel from a safe haven of Jews into an occupier of substantial numbers of Palestinians has transformed what had been a historical example of two people engaged in decolonization after the Second World War into something worse. And I would believe, I would hope that the certainty that there is justice only on one side is something that we would all abjure. I would hope that we could do that. My first job, as you said, my first job was at the Hebrew University, Jerusalem. It's a city I know, a language I know. The nation engaged in this war is tragic, and the Palestinian nation is tragically braided together with the Israeli nation in a horrible and destructive moment. I think that's why, in answer to the question, people who have certainty that there's right on only one side are dangerous.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm afraid we've already run out of time. It's already 2. So what remains for me to do is, Professor Winter, so please everyone join me in thanking Professor Winter. And I think we're also all looking forward to your lecture on Saturday. So thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Of course, yeah. Yeah, of course. 15.
Yes. Oh, well, yes, thank you very much. It's very kind. Oops. Yeah.
Yeah, I already said to the channel. Sorry, I forgot to. I thought he would just be busy, but